I had been hired to be the secretary for the editorial page editor, and he said, you must meet Ben Bradlee, and he took me in to meet Ben, and I was totally dazzled. I thought he was the Sun King, and I couldn't believe how attractive he was. And then I left, and the next day I got fired because the editor said I was overqualified to be his secretary because I couldn't type and I couldn't file. So a couple of years passed, and I got a call from this gruff voice on the other end of the line saying, would you like to come in for a job interview to be a party reporter? And he said, my name is Ben Bradlee. I'm the editor of the Washington Post. I thought, oh, as if I didn't know, if I didn't remember. And so I went in and interviewed him, and with my little white gloves, and we got along really well. I mean, he was 20 years older than I was, and he was married. But I just thought he was the most sexy, dynamic, incredible, charismatic man I'd ever met in my life. I was completely bowled over. And for some reason, I was very cheeky and very feisty with him. And sort of we got into this sort of sparring relationship. We had a great interview. And at the end of the interview, he said, well, I'd like to see something you've written. And I said, well, I've never written anything. And he said, well, nobody's perfect. You're hired. And so he did hire me, and I started covering parties, which in Washington is like covering politics because you're covering official functions. And it was 4 years later that we were on the same plane down to the convention in Miami. We were seated together by the post-travel people. And both of us fell in love with each other on the plane down, although we didn't admit it to each other until about a year later. And it was a year later, right in the middle of Watergate, where I was in love with him, and I didn't know he was in love with me. And I actually went to one of my friends and said, I'm in love with Ben Bradlee. I'm going to tell him. And he said, you can't do that, because if he took you up on it, it would destroy the Watergate. It would destroy the story, the paper, the country. You can't. You have to put your country first. And being an Army brat, of course, it was the only thing he could say to me that would make a difference. So I didn't say anything. And then I quit the paper to go to New York to be the first network anchor woman in America, and told him after I quit that I was leaving because I was in love with him. And he said, well, I can't believe it. I'm in love with you too. And so we ended up together, and 4 or 5 months later we came out as a couple, and we were together for 43 years. I think people were really stunned. I mean, but at that point, when we got together, was after I had left the paper. And I came back to Washington, and there was, people didn't quite know how to handle it. It was sort of a scandal. But Catherine Graham, who was the publisher of the paper and who sort of decided who was in and who was out, I quit CBS to come back to be with Ben on December the 7th. I left the CBS Morning News, and she had a big dinner party that night, invited Ben and me to come. And the minute we walked in the door, everybody said, okay, they're accepted. It's accepted. Well, they met when Ben was at Newsweek, and Jack Kennedy was a senator, and they lived next door to each other, and they became best friends, and their kids were honorary godparents of their 2 children, and they saw each other all the time. And then when he was elected president, as Jack said to Ben, you don't make new friends once you're in the White House, and so they were they relied a lot on their old friends, and Ben and Tony, his then wife, were there, 3 times a week. I think that with Ben and Jack Kennedy, it's always a double-edged sword, because if you do have a good friend who's a good source, then you get a lot more information than you normally would, and it can be very helpful to your career. So obviously Ben was using Jack to get information, and Jack was using Ben to hopefully get better press. But both of them understood that was part of the game. And I think at one point, Ben said early on, look, I just want you to know I'm taking notes on everything that we say. Every night when I go home, I write down my notes. And Jack said, well, I just assume that. And all I ask is that you wait until 10 years after I'm out of office before you publish anything. And after 10 years, after the assassination, Ben wrote his book, Conversations with Kennedy, in which he just basically it was a love letter, really, but he really published his conversation. And there was a time when Ben published something that really made Jack angry, and he was very upset and didn't like it, and so he banished Ben from the White House for